This podcast is brought to you by Cyber attacks can be prevented. Checkpoint. You deserve the best security.
As Israel's government takes shape, what exactly is the place of the ultra-Orthodox Haredi parties in Israeli politics? We'll be talking about that, the fact that it's very cold and a certain person marks a big anniversary. It's unholy. I'm Jonathan Friedland of The Guardian in London.
And I'm Yonit Levy of Channel 12 in Tel Aviv.
Two Jews on the news from Keshet podcast, and one of those Jews has marked a big landmark milestone moment. She, of course, left her own devices, would say nothing about this because modesty becomes her. But how many years exactly is it? Yonit Levy, you have sat in the most watched chair in Israeli broadcasting, namely as anchor of Israel's Channel 12 News. A little Hebrew-speaking bird tells me it is 20 years to the day as you and I speak. Huge event in national news in Israel, surely.
It's, my son described it to me this morning, Jonathan. He said, Mommy's having a birthday at work. So
it's a work birthday. He's right.
Exactly. So that's what it feels like. Yes, 20 years ago today, December 15th, 2002, is when I started anchoring the evening news. It was then Channel 2. I did it for 5 years with a co-anchor who is a man. He left, and then my boss, in a pretty unprecedented moment, decided that I should just anchor the news by myself. So that was when I became the sole anchor of, for the first time in this country, actually, and before the United States, of the evening news on the commercial channel. It's been 20 years. It's Israel, so it kind of feels like 90.
45 years. But the thing is, a normal person marking 20 years at the very pinnacle of Israeli broadcast journalism would be about 70 years old, really, or maybe 60 years old. But you're miles away from that. So and I know I go on about this a lot, even when we talk not on podcast time. I don't get still how you were put in this job, the anchor's chair, when you were basically not much older than my children. You were in your early 20s. Yes. And projected, I mean, that surely in Israeli news terms shook up the whole industry. No one could believe that. It would be like the editor of The Guardian being 23 years old. I mean, it just doesn't happen.
It wasn't, I mean, I'm not sure if they had more time to pick someone. I assume it wouldn't have been me, to be honest. But my predecessor kind of left in this dramatic middle of the night moment to cross the road and go to the competitors. This was a huge earthquake in Israeli media standards 20 years ago. And they kind of needed someone quick. And I was sort of up-and-coming correspondent in the foreign desk. And I had done very little anchoring of bulletins and things like that, news updates. And my boss at the time, the CEO of the company, said to me, like, if I wish I had 10 years to wait, I don't. So yeah, that was the story.
And you were thrown right in at the deep end, right? Because that would have been during the Second Intifada, really at its peak. I mean, the country would have been looking to the news for, yes, updates and information, but also kind of reassurance. I mean, that role of being the TV news anchor in moments of crisis, the famous one is Walter Cronkite breaking the news of Kennedy's assassination. But even here, we know, announcing the Queen's death, there's an emotional connection between the person who tells the country the news and the public. And to have that from somebody so young, I just think that, and you've had it now for 20 years, but what that does for them, what it does for you, it's a big thing.
I really do.
Yeah.
I essentially, when I look back at those tapes, besides terrible haircut, my second thought is just how much of an effort I made to sound and look older than I was. Kind of the sound, the voice going down a few octaves and trying to talk like that. So I made an effort. I don't know how much it worked at the beginning, but somehow it did. And yay, we're talking about me. Let's change the subject, please.
Yeah, no, it's your least favorite subject, listeners to Unholy. You should know that unlike a lot of very well-known people, Yonit Levy really does not like talking about herself. This is outside the comfort zone. We won't keep you there much longer because we have many other things to chat and talk about this week. I was going to tell you that it's very snowy here.
Let's talk about that. Oh my! I had to drag you to send me pictures, by the way, because you
I did do that. The thing British
them.
people do when they detect any embarrassment in a conversation, in this case, you being embarrassed about me bragging about your achievements, the British people, of course, default to the weather because they can, it's like shuffling and staring at your feet. You start talking about the weather. In this case, there's much to talk about because I look out now of my window, and even 4 days on, it is still looking like a Christmas card, a light dusting of snow on the treetops. It looks like people go for different references. They either say it's Charles Dickens's London, or they say it's a Richard Curtis movie, if you've seen any of those. London does look beautiful. It has looked beautiful this week, but perilous. We have been slipping and sliding as we have been heading out of our homes. But I know you had a very indifferent take to me on the fact that it is freezing cold here in London, which I hadn't thought of. It was a very Israeli perspective you had on it all.
Yeah, it was interesting. Last week, we spoke to Antonia Yamin, who's a correspondent and analyst at Bild, and we had a really interesting conversation about the far right in Germany. And we met a day after recording the podcast, and she said to me, "You Israelis are living in La La Land." I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Everything is lit in Israel. There's light, there's electricity everywhere." She said, "In Germany, in Berlin, things are completely dark." And I sort of called you up. I said, "How are things in London? Are they dark?" And you said they aren't. And obviously, this is very relevant because of Christmas and that lighting. You think about the fact that here it's still pretty warm, there's no energy crisis looming, and the rest of Europe is just in a completely different situation.
Yeah, I always thought that if there were ever to be an energy crisis in Israel, the way it would manifest itself is at the other end of the spectrum, meaning a good day where there is 45 degrees centigrade heat and the air conditioning gives out because there's just not enough power to keep the aircon on. Here, across Europe, the fear has been that actually as we go into this deep midwinter, that either the lights go off or people can't heat their homes. And that, by the way, is already here, not in the sense of there just being no electricity when you turn the switch on or off, but rather people's struggles to afford heating. I mean, it is so cataclysmically expensive. We have made perhaps the mistake of having a smart meter installed in our home. We did it for sort of environmental reason, wanted to see how much energy we're using. But my God, the price, you really see in real time, put the kettle on for a cup of tea, wow. British reference again, and you see the meter go up, the rate go up there and then. Now, we're okay. We can afford to pay those bills, but there are people who cannot. And The Guardian has been running for several months the Heat or Eat diaries. These are diaries written by real people, often using just their first names for obvious reasons, explaining their struggles and choosing whether to shiver or starve, as one former politician put it here. That's the choice, whether you heat your homes or eat. Many people cannot do both, including people who never would have considered themselves to be poor. I mean, people in work doing, relatively jobs that would have been thought of as well rewarded. I read just this morning that there's people who are administering the benefit system, welfare system, guiding people as to how they can claim their benefits, who are themselves on benefits, because those jobs don't pay enough both to heat your homes when it costs this much and to eat. So, talk of blackouts and energy rationing, that is still there as we look into January, February. It could come. But right now, there is a sort of, as it was, an invisible or sort of silent energy crisis. It's not manifest in, the lights on the streets being out, but in the privacy of people's homes, people shivering because they cannot afford to pay for it.
That's terrible. I mean, we were thinking, we had this discussion before winter about the energy crisis and is it as bad as we thought? It sounds like it's worse than we thought it would be before winter started.
Yeah, I would say so, because, there's all kinds of reasons. Starts in some ways with the February invasion of Ukraine by Vladimir Putin's Russia and what that did to energy prices. There's some recrimination here that, Britain had a facility for storing gas, but it got rid of it in recent years, all part of a kind of austerity drive by the Conservative government that had been here 12 years. They saw that as a way to make a cost saving. It meant that Britain went into this energy crisis much less well prepared. But then, Germany, who were somehow, in some ways prepared, are feeling it in the way that Antonia explained to us and explained to you, So there's, a decision. One thing you hear that is unexpected is that few people around the place, around Europe, are saying, Donald Trump, you've got to bow to no one in how much you dislike the guy, but on one thing he was right, they say, which is he did say to Angela Merkel, what on earth are you doing, making yourself, in effect, a hostage by being so dependent on Russia for your energy? And at the time, because it was Donald Trump saying it, because everything else you said was so, wrong, they dismissed it. But, even a stopped clock is right twice a day. And on that, he was, right. I mean, it was probably a big strategic mistake for Western Europe to be dependent on this dictator who has no compunction about using his energy muscle as leverage against Europe, and it's the ordinary people of Europe who are really suffering.
I know the Jonathan Friedland train of thought is really desperately looking for something optimistic to say. So maybe at least we can, cuddle up to that news story breaking this week, which is that U.S. scientists announce historic nuclear fusion energy breakthrough. Maybe that is the most important thing that happened this week. And we might be looking back and saying, okay, this saved, I'm being hyperbolic, but this saved humanity, right? A little bit.
No, I don't. I'm so with you on this. And I urge listeners to go back to our earlier episode. Yonit will tell you the exact number, when we interviewed Malcolm Gladwell, who is the sort of laureate of optimism, the prophet of hope. And that's part of his sort of image and brand. But he caught me at a moment of feeling a bit despairing. And when you and I spoke to him, I said, look, there's so much to be worried about, starting with the climate crisis. And he said, look, the climate crisis is essentially a problem of energy. You can suck the carbon out of the atmosphere if you have enough energy, and energy is about to be free, in effect, free of charge. And at the time, I remember thinking, oh, right, he's saying we will get there with solar and, renewable energy. That's what he must mean. And then look, as my mother would have said, punk, right away, you get this, less than, a month later, we get this, scientific breakthrough that fusion technology may be there, which would be a free way to make massive amounts of energy and power, which is a very upbeat thought to take us in towards the end of 2022. But lest we get too much of a spring in our step. If anyone wants to go
back and listen to it, Jonathan.
Which one was it?
It's episode 81, if anyone wants to go back.
The human database has spoken. But just in case you feel there's too much of a spring in your step, I speak obviously not for all listeners, you can just be brought back to reality with talk of the emerging Israeli government.
That's what I'm here for.
Weeks and weeks have passed, but still no official government, but it's sort of taking shape, isn't it?
So it has been 6 weeks since the elections. The Netanyahu, Ben Gvir, Smotrich government has not yet been sworn in. I'm sure you're waiting to ask me, Jonathan, why is it taking so long? I guess by Israeli standards, it's not exceptionally long for negotiations, for coalition negotiations, but given how this homogenous group has formed, it seemed like it should have taken less. I spoke to a very smart analyst this morning who said to me, they won too big, right? So there are certain parties in this coalition who kind of believe it's their dream now to fulfill whatever they've been planning. So they want their aspirations. There's a lot of tugging and pulling here. And at this point, what we're seeing really is that there's a lot of pre-swearing in legislation going on and votes on different legislation going on. I think we should go through what they are because it's very important, and also explain why it's happening before the swearing in of the government and not after. So I'll get to that point, but I think that we should go over the 3 different laws that are going to be probably passed through the Knesset. One is the dairy law. It's named after Aryeh Deri. At least that's the way it's dubbed. It needs to enable Aryeh Deri, the leader of Shas, to serve as a minister despite his conviction for tax offenses. By the way, in 2 years' time, he will be the Minister of Finance in rotation with Bezalel Smotrich. That is the Aryeh Deri law that has already passed in its preliminary reading. The Smotrich law, we talked about this a lot on the podcast. This will enable Bezalel Smotrich to receive the jurisdiction over 2 defense ministry bodies. One is the civil administration. The other is coordinator of the government activities in the territories, essentially giving Bezalel Smotrich a lot of the power over what happens in the settlements. Finally, what has been dubbed the Ben Gvir law, and is the most contentious of all of these, giving Itamar Ben Gvir unprecedented power, not only as Minister of Police, what we would call Minister of Police, now we're already calling it Minister of National Security. Will he be actually, he wants to be responsible for dictating policy over police indictments. This is very questionable. I'm not sure this whole law will pass as it is. I think what's important to say here is that all of the coalition partners are saying behind closed doors, we don't trust Netanyahu to live up to his promises after the government is sworn in. That is why we're making it a point to change all these laws now.
Rattling through all those, it becomes so clear the extent to which Netanyahu, despite getting the headlines of having won the election in November, is a prisoner of the right of his coalition, embryonic coalition. The very fact that all these moves are happening, that these parties of the right are getting their wish list, suggests the extent to which he is their captive. And, it struck me that his brand internationally as well as at home, I think, is as a strongman. And yet as strongmen go, he's looking pretty weak when these other mini strongmen are getting to dictate his agenda. And I do wonder, it's a question, it's not an assertion at all, but whether that begins at some point to eat into his own standing, because his brand, his reputation is that he is a strong guy. And I just wonder if Israelis begin to see him being sort of bossed around by other people, whether that just chips away at his own standing. All of that said, those points are, political process points in relative to the bigger point, which is, I think, all three of the things, almost in ascending order, actually, of the changes you've described are, to me, pretty repellent and cut against Israel's long-time boast to be the only democracy in the Middle East. If you mean by democracy, by the way, just having elections, okay, fine. But normally people mean by democracy a liberal democracy, referring to those institutional protections. And yet I think the changes you've described there add up to a kind of illiberal democracy. Remember, that was the phrase Viktor Orban used in Hungary. If you are having a minister, a politician, in charge, in effect, of operational police actions, deciding who to investigate, who not, when to go in hard, when not to, a politician rather than a serving police officer, that is Orbanism. If you are having the civil administration of the occupied West Bank in the hands of one person, and a person like Bezalel Smotrich, again, repeating, I said it for your earlier podcast, a man who says he doesn't want, Arab new mothers next to Jewish new mothers in the same maternity ward as the ruler of the of the West Bank, including, which includes obviously a population outside those settlements. I know that the civil administration is a different thing, and that Palestinians are under military rule, different thing. But making him in effect like a sort of Roman governor in those territories, and then finally bending the law to get one of your pals. I know Derry is not a personal pal of Netanyahu, but a political ally. Bend to get round the law, so you have to change the law to allow a convicted minister to serve again. I know I summarize, perhaps simplistically, but all of these things seem to me to be, if we were writing about Hungary, we would call that Orbanism. If we would say the same in other places in Europe. These are retrograde steps for Israel to be taking. And I wonder again about Israel's standing abroad, and even Netanyahu's personally, because he is obviously doing what his partners are telling him and wanting him to do.
And it has not yet started. We have not yet sworn in this government. We should mention that again. I will add on to upon all this the fact that the long list of demands of Yahadut HaTorah, United Torah Judaism, also an important coalition partner for Netanyahu. Our friend of the pod, Amit Segal, our analyst here on Channel 12, published that list of demands this week. Some of them really enraging the non-Haredi community, clausing about not producing electricity on the Sabbath and intervening in the study curriculum of the secular education system. Now, I don't know how much of this will be left in the true coalition agreement, but it's very, very clear that the Haredi autonomy will be expanded in Israel, further funded by the Israeli taxpayer. This issue is something that will become a very big topic in this Netanyahu government. By the way, Jonathan, the only thing that can really be changed dramatically, Netanyahu himself promised it won't be in an interview to NBC. He's only giving those interviews in English, not in Hebrew. But that is the law of return and an amendment to that law. We know that there are many parties in this coalition, this future coalition, that want to change the grandson clause. That could actually happen. What the rest will be, we don't know yet, but a really contentious conversation in Israel today.
And the grandson clause being the notion that if you have one Jewish grandparent, that is enough to qualify as a Jew under the law of return. I've heard some people sometimes say with sort of bitter irony, it's the kind of Nuremberg standard. In other words, if you are deemed Jewish enough to be a target for persecution and murder by the Nazis, then you should be Jewish enough to seek refuge. In Israel, that has always been the policy, and coming into question now with the Haredim, which is a cue for us to have a conversation we've long wanted to have on this podcast. We've talked about Haredim in Israel and outside, in diaspora, whether in London's Stamford Hill or in Brooklyn's Crown Heights and Williamsburg, but obviously crucially in Israel itself. We've talked about that group often. We've always wanted to talk with somebody from that community. It's been a sort of on our wish list for a long time to go bigger, more than just about this week's politics up and down, coalition, horse trading, etc., but about the bigger question of where Haredim fit in Israel and in the Jewish world. So who are we going to speak to, Yonid?
Eli Paley is the owner of Mishpaca, a media group and publisher of the Mishpaca Weekly magazine, the most popular Haredi magazine here in Israel. It comes out in English as well. He's a businessman, a social activist, also the founder of the Haredi Institute for Public Affairs, a very clear voice from the heart of the Haredi community, and that is what we're looking for. Eli, thank you so much for talking to us today on Unholy.
Thank you. My pleasure.
We want to talk about so many things, the workforce and education and military service, diaspora relationships. So I want to pick up by the fact that your magazine, and we should tell our listeners, tackles many issues that the Haredi community at times is reluctant to tackle. I think you were the first to actually ask about the challenges of the workforce, of the Haredi workforce, and the economic challenges the Haredim face in the Israeli society. So as plainly as possible, if I can ask you, if today there are about 50% of the Haredi male population, they're a part of the workforce, if that trajectory doesn't change, how is this sustainable simply for Israeli economy?
It's definitely one of the biggest challenges, but always what I'm trying to say, that the way to measure the involvement of the Haredi society in the workforce is to look at the households and not to try to divide it by gender. Because what we saw in the last 10, 15 years, we saw a dramatical increase in Haredi women joining the workforce, and taking into account that we're talking about women that they have big families, 6, 8, sometimes even 10 kids. So the fact that it can work, it's only because, at least by the Haredi society, their perspective is to trying to see in the household what's the best way or what's the most efficient way to bring the better income to the family. So that always, when we are looking at the Haredi society, we should try always to see what happened, what's the shift that happened by the households. And I'll give you just one analysis. I think in 2015, the government set up a goal that they want to reach 63% of Haredi men and 63% of Haredi women going to work. And the surprise was that after a very short time, the women exceed the percentage, and now we're close to 80, 70, 79% of the women, and the men went up to 50. But if you will take the average, 50 plus 80, I didn't learn Liba, the curriculum.
We'll talk about that.
The math, okay, but the math comes to that we got an average of 63% and even more, which means there is two lessons that I learned from these goals. A, that sometimes when the government is trying to set up goals, they need first to understand the nuances and the culture of the Haredi society. And in many cases, what I find is the government have good intentions, but they are missing a real understanding about where are the real opportunities. I think we should continue to do an effort to provide men who wants to go to work or wants to combine between learning Torah and work. I think this is the next opportunity that we should talk about, to give them the opportunities to get the best vocational training and the best opportunity to really maximize their potential in working, not necessarily by convincing them to decide whether they want to stay in yeshiva or to go to work, and to build more a hybrid model that they can combine between them. But on the other hand, to understand that the main engine growth of the Haredi economy, and I think even the Israel economy, is the huge potential by Haredi women. And unfortunately, the government is not putting enough attention to this huge potential. And I think this is where the part of the solution exists.
Is this a case, though, where one solution then just creates another problem? And I'm thinking particularly of those Haredi women who are bringing up 6 or 8 children who are already unbelievably stretched, who now are also on top of that taking on paid work. And I say this as somebody who lives in a Haredi neighborhood here in London. I notice exactly this trend going on here. I don't see the women doing any less of the domestic work. I don't see the men stepping up and suddenly taking on the childcare, the cooking, the cleaning, and preparing for the Chagim. The women are still doing all of that as well. And on top of that, they are having to earn a wage. So you've replaced one problem, which, you know, the figures you've given are very striking, but with a new injustice, which is a whole lot of Haredi women working, 18, 20 hours a day to do 2, 3, 4 jobs at once.
So, Jonathan, I have few perspective to relate to your insight. First, from my experience, it's not really the case. The case is really the opposite. We find out in our studies, by the way, that women are able to have a real career in high-tech in other areas just because their husband is the secondary breadwinner, and they are allowing them to work and to take a career. I have in my company 80% of the employees are women, and in top positions, including the editor of our international edition and marketing managers and others, and the CPA.
But
and
isn't she also making the chicken soup on a Friday night? That same woman? I bet she is.
We have to ask her. I personally love to cook myself, so I don't know, maybe her husband likes to do it as well.
But are men taking on some of that work at home?
Absolutely. At least you're living here. So if you will walk in a Haredi neighborhood in the morning or around noontime, I'll give you just one example. So you will see hundreds of men carrying a baby stroller and taking the kids to the doctor. Sometimes there is even a debate in the Haredi society saying, is that ideal if the woman is sacrificing to help her husband to sit and learn, and he find himself in a part-time position as a second mother, so maybe it's not ideal. So for sure, from my knowledge in the Haredi society, I see that in most of the cases, the husbands are really taking a big part of the burden and helping their wives. But I want to address this issue from other perspective. We're talking about society that appreciates very much Torah learning. I'm not sure that our role, and I'm talking about myself and talking about you and even the government, is to intervene in their priorities and say, listen, I don't think that it's ideal that the women will sacrifice so much to support their husband to sit and learn. I think the women should stay home like in Europe and raise the kids, and maybe we should convince the husbands to go to work. I think we should at least respect that there are mature people who can make their own choices. I agree with you that in some cases, the women, as usual, the women they're jungling between many jobs, not just in the Haredi world, and I'm always amazed and appreciate what the women can accomplish. But in a way, what I'm trying to say that by understanding the Haredi culture, sometimes these specific characters of the society bring opportunities, especially for women. We see women that without this, if the husband will take the main role in going to work, many of them won't be able to accomplish the jobs and the career that they're accomplishing today.
But it's not only a distinction of the workforce, Eli. There's a distinction in education. You're saying yourself, you didn't study Liba, you didn't study core studies. There's actually this discussion here in Israel right now. There's a potential for parts of the Haredi community to study core curriculum and have the budgets equalized. Then Netanyahu kind of intervened and said, forget it, I'm going to equalize, I'm going to give you the same budgets, you're not going to have to study this. How can Israel remain a prosperous first world state if the education is not at that level? Isn't that a huge problem that we're staring at?
With your permission, I would call it a challenge instead of a problem. But again, we definitely all agree that there is a challenge in the Haredi boys' schools. And the challenge is combined from two aspects. A, we have to understand that by Haredim, the definition of education, or the main goal in education, is not to prepare the kids to become an adult who can join the workforce. The main goal, how we can create a Jewish identity, how we can create the next generation of people who are devoted and connected to the Jewish heritage and the Jewish values. So this is a different language. When you are coming to a Haredi family And we know this is the highest priority for Haredi family, to make sure that the kids are getting the best education from their perspective, which means the best education is to get and to raise, at least with the boys, the next generation of Talmidei Chachamim, so they understand that they are paying some price by compromising between putting the attention in Torah learning or giving them other studies. So, but once we understand and appreciate their perspective, then we can come and offer an alternative ways to complete or what needed to be done. I think that there is no any rejection in general by Haredim, depends on the age, but to give any complementary education. I see Haredi kids are going to take private classes in English and math. I see parents who are able to do it are making it. Some of them are doing it in later stage in their life. The question is always, do we expect Haredim to adapt the secular model of education, which the main focus, and again, I'm not criticizing, but I'm saying it's total different language. You're measuring success in the Western education if the kids are growing up and becoming very relevant to the workforce. Haredim are first measuring the kids, are they becoming real Jewish people who can continue the Jewish people. Once we respect it and we can work with it, I think there is much to do even with the boys. And still, we shouldn't forget, the girls, 50% of the Haredi population are getting top education. Girls in the high school are making today 4 and 5 units mathematics and English. And I think this is, again, where instead of trying to push Haredim to the areas that they less convenience to go, let's first work with the willingness that already exists, and that's already can make a huge change for the Israeli economy and for the Haredi economy as well.
So I get that, and the legitimacy of thinking, look, people will pursue different paths, and it's about respecting that difference. And I'm struck by your notion that it's a non-Western set of expectations and metrics, and that's all great. But it comes down, doesn't it, though, to a problem of fairness, or a challenge of fairness, to use your preferred word, which is if paying into the national sort of coffers, the ultra-Orthodox Haredim are putting in, as I understand it, about 4%, 3.9% contribution of taxation, while the non-Orthodox, non-Haredi putting in basically 87%, and yet those don't reflect the proportions in population. There's a fairness problem there, which is Haredim are able to live this admittedly different lifestyle with different values, which is wonderful and much more spiritual and not driven by the usual competitive sort of capitalist metrics. Wonderful. But it's not fair, because the people who are making that possible, who are contributing to the resources of the country, are the non-Orthodox. And in effect, the Haredim are, passengers on a vehicle driven by other people. And that's not fair, and it gets resented.
I totally agree with you that if this is the case, I'm not sure that this is the case. I'm not part of the 3.9% of the people who contribute to the Israeli economy.
You're a very successful businessman, one should say.
Yes.
You're part of that. Yeah.
Yes. Who runs a company that we have over 150 employees, and running a family charity who gives millions of shekels every year to charity. So I think that there is much, I'm not sure about the measurement. It's really hard to measure, but in general, let's agree that for sure we should think about the sustainability of this model. And for sure, Haredim have no right to expect to say, okay, we want to live in a very modest lifestyle. We want to appreciate different kind of education, but we want other people to take this responsibility. I think it's a fair question, and it's a fair challenge that we have to sit around the table and solve the problems. From my perspective, and I'm devoting my effort and my life to bring these kind of solutions to the table, and in many cases, the obstacle is still to convince the decision makers to understand that, yes, we have to, instead of fighting about narratives, what education is about and who is doing better in terms of poverty and economy, is to try to see Haredi society understand that the role, they are not anymore a small minority in the Israeli society. And for sure, when today, I don't know, again, you spoke about the economy, I can speak about just the school rate. Today, 26% of the Jewish kids in the first class, meaning every fourth child in the first grade in school is a Haredi boy. So you don't have to be very paranoid or anti-Haredi to ask the question how the economy, and not just the economy, how the security system is going to be sustainable with these numbers. So I'm totally with you in this concern. The question is, what are we doing with this concern? And there is two kinds of conversation in the Israeli society. One is, okay, so Haredim, it's about time that you will give up your values and agree to accept and to adapt our values, because otherwise it's not going to work, or we are not ready to continue to support, or to say, listen, we understand your contribution to the Jewish peoplehood. We understand your contribution to the Jewish future, but you have to understand that we have to create a dialogue. And I think today I see more and more Haredim, including, by the way, this coming government, understanding that it's about time to take steps and to initiate different approach and different attitude. But the way to make it happen is, instead of coming or fighting about narratives, is to try to come with your concern and said, okay, let's sit around the table and see, okay, with the fact that every fourth child is a Haredi child, how do we see the forecast of Haredi contribution? Haredim, I think, can do much more than what they're doing today. They can contribute much more than they're doing today, and we have to find out what are the obstacles. So the challenge, there is definitely a challenge of making core studies more accessible to Haredi kids, boys and girls. But again, as I said, I don't find that there is a big barrier to get a Haredi who got yeshiva education to be successful. There is some areas that this lack of the core studies is really a challenge. But I think, not everybody needs to go in this direction, meaning not everybody needs to be a doctor or needs to be a scientist. But there is so much we can do with Haredim, taking their talent, taking their values. They like to be in jobs that not necessarily are making the best way to make money, it's being in jobs that they can really serve the community more in the welfare area, and we see so many Haredim are working for nonprofits and trying to help other people. I think this is an advantage that some people want to have a big career and to maximize their potential to make enough money, and some other people wants to be in the field of education and welfare and treatment and etc. And Haredim can be a huge contribution to this future of Israel.
Let's talk about, we mentioned the issue of fairness, and obviously the whole issue about enlisting into the Israeli military, a sore point for many non-Haredim in this country. Now, I would, I'm carefully saying this, Eli, but I would assume that most non-Haredim have given up on their fantasies to see Haredim in large number, Orthodox Jews in large numbers enlisting. But now what you have, especially in the political system, and so much power that the ultra-Orthodox parties have received in this election, what you see is a little bit like the loss of, I say, a little bit of scorn or contempt, right? You see Gafni and Goldknop, the heads of United Torah Judaism, of Yahadut HaTorah, saying things like, half of us are going to the military, half of us are going to study Torah, or it's harder to study Torah than it is to serve in the military. These are things that used to be, if they were ever said, they were never said out loud. And it sounds like a little bit of the busha in Hebrew, right? The shame of it kind of left the building.
Yes. First, I agree with you. I'm not comfortable with this kind of response and conversation. I think that whatever we believe about the role of the yeshiva boys to the future of people and the Torah for the future of the Jewish people, I think first we have to respect and really appreciate and do the best we can, and especially I expect from Haredi politicians to do their best to appreciate people who are devoting their time and life, especially for real contribution in the army. And I think that's the key for me, from my perspective. On the other hand, we can't forget the environment of the conversation. And yes, after a year or year and a half, or maybe after a long time, that always the yeshiva and the Torah system is under attack. And always trying to see that even a boy who went to the army to be a jobnik or to do whatever, he's doing much more for the future of the state of Israel than a Haredi boy. So yes, the conversation is becoming a very arrogant and very anti. And I feel bad for it. Again, I think that at the end of the day, we should try to find a common denominator. We should create a different kind of dialogue between the challenges that we're facing. But practically speaking, I think, and you need to mention it, I think that most of the seculars already gave up having Haredi in big numbers in the army. But it's much more complicated, because in the past, 7-10 years, when I have conversation with my secular friends talking about the army, so usually what I hear from them is the following. we don't really want Haredim to be in the army because we want the army to stay the way the army is today. And today the army is much more pro mixed gender service and etc. And we're really afraid from the day the Haredi will take us seriously and they will come with big numbers to the army because that won't be anymore the army that I want my son or my daughter to go to serve to. But at least let them do something for national service. And I think this is very insulting. Because if the conversation is really about the challenges of the security of Israel, Haredim will be the first one to join this conversation and to see what they can do under their limitations or under their terms to see what they can contribute. And I'll bring you an example about one of the efforts that I myself was doing. But when the conversation is, listen, we don't really think that we need you at the army. And especially, I once told one of my senior people from the army who spoke to me about this issue, I said, if you would come to the rabbis 5 years ago, 3 years ago, and say, listen, we see the forecast of the boys and girls in Israel, and 10 years from now, if we won't have at least 20% of Haredi boys going to the army, we are in a real danger. I can't promise you what will be the results, but the conversation about Haredim serving in the army, it doesn't really come from the need. Okay, the army now is really facing a shortage of people, and the case is really the opposite. The army is really facing a challenge. What can we do with the growing numbers of boys? But you Haredim, at least do something. And this is insulting because Haredi believe that when he gives up and he sends his kids to yeshiva, and a boy who knows that he can build his economic career and he's devoting his best years in yeshiva, and to say, okay, yeshiva is nice, but please close the Gemara, go to do something that it's much more important. This is a conversation that creates a sense of, okay, so you don't really appreciate our values. And I think the key to have this conversation is, as you mentioned, we should face, and I think it's a mutual concern that we should all be aware of, looking at the growing number of the Israeli demographic, seeing the demographic changes in Israel, how our security, our defense is going to look like 10 or 15 years from now.
Let me bring it crashing down to sort of more day-to-day reality a bit with the politics. And I wonder about this. A lot of people around the world have seen, I know this is not the political party that you're aligned with or anything like it, but, have seen the rise of Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich and the religious Zionism party. And I've had conversations in the diaspora where people are saying, this is a crisis for religious Judaism, because these people are saying what they're saying in the name of Judaism. They call themselves religious in the actual name of their party. And what they say, what I hear is, where are the religious voices speaking from the religion saying that what the kind of, and Ben-Gvir has been literally convicted in an Israeli court of incitement to racism, where are the voices saying this kind of talk is a violation of or deeply at odds with the Jewish teachings that, yes, Jewish young men are learning in yeshiva day in, day out. And instead, on the contrary, what they see is quite a lot of young, strictly Orthodox boys voting for Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. I know that's been an issue within the Haredi community, not voting for the traditional parties, but sort of defecting and voting there. But where is that voice of condemnation that would say, almost in the language of morality and ethics and Judaism, that this is really a kind of desecration, that's the word I'm looking for, of Jewish values?
First, based on our finding, we made an analysis in the Haredi Institute of Public Affairs right after the election. I also was expecting to see much bigger number of Haredim shifting from voting for the traditional parties to Ben-Gvir. We didn't see a big shift. Yes, in general, Ben-Gvir was very charismatic and got many people to support him, even from kibbutzim. So some of this phenomenon also happened in the Haredi society, but we didn't see any special trend Haredi that was different from what we saw in other societies as well. Now, I have to tell you, I know I was following Ben-Gvir in the past few years. I saw changes in the way that Ben-Gvir was even talking recently. I think that Ben-Gvir stepped into a vacuum about the personal security in Israel. And I think the reason why people feel comfortable with Ben-Gvir, because they feel that something in the Israeli system doesn't work well, especially after the crisis that happened with the Shomer HaChomot. People felt that even in their cities, they are not secure, and not mention what's happening in the Negev and other places. again, I think that I don't, at least myself, I didn't see yet Itamar Ben-Gvir is really doing things that it's really, I can call them discrimination or racism. Yes, sometimes he's a very populist. He knows how to speak. So I don't see why the rabbinical leadership, and by the way, trust me, they have, from political point of view, they have an interest to try to criticize Ben-Gvir if they were afraid that he is doing it. But I agree with you that we have to be more sensitive about the way that we're speaking about our brothers and our Arab friends. I don't see that this is the main issue the Haredi society is facing today and saying, listen, it's about time that we Haredi will stand and protect from Ben-Gvir. I have a different assumption about his role in the next 3 or 4 years in trying to create, and I think the fact that he's now entering into a real position and not to be just running in a television can make a big difference, and times will tell.
Eli Paley, we really thank you so much for talking to us. It was a real eye-opener. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anit, and thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you. Fascinating conversation. So glad we did it. He's a very personable, very fluent and very good advocate, I think, for his community. Obviously, if we'd had more time, I'd have come back to him on this point about where he says, look, Itamar Ben-Gvir so far hasn't done anything, that troubles me, meaning, since the election. That's kind of not the point. The point is that this man has a long history, a long track record of a conviction for incitement to racism, deemed so extreme he was barred from serving in the military, and putting up in his home a portrait of Baruch Goldstein, the man responsible for the Hebron massacre in 1994. That's Ben-Gvir's record, and therefore what I was really looking for from Eli was some acknowledgement that itself, the history, should be deeply troubling to people of religious faith. And but look, really interesting to hear his answers to that and to all the other things we put to it.
Yeah, and to finally kind of hear from inside the community what it feels like and what it sounds like and what kind of conversation we can be having. He's one of those people who really knows and really focuses on that conversation. He realizes that the future of Israel depends on that conversation between the Haredi community and the non-Haredi community. I'm very glad that he came on. I think we have some awards to give out on occasion in this program, Jonathan.
We do have some awards. I thought a nominee for Mensch would be the Speaker of the House of Commons, Sir Lindsay Hoyle, and also his invited guests. That's because this week, on Thursday, actually, in the House of Commons, they had a moment of silence to recall the similar moment that happened 80 years ago. It was actually on the 17th of December, 1942, when the then Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden brought to the House of Commons word of the government's knowledge of the Nazis' murderous plan for the Jews of Europe. He told them, look, we have reliable reports regarding the barbarous and inhuman treatment to which Jews are being subjected in German-occupied Europe. And he gave a very sort of sketched, outline, provisional account of what we would later call the Holocaust. And it's entered into sort of House of Commons parliamentary legend that MPs were sort of hushed by what they heard. They were sort of stunned by what they heard. And so eventually a Labour MP said, why don't we all rise in our places and have a minute of silent protest? And it's seen as very rare because House of Commons doesn't really go in for things like that, doesn't often do them. This one was sort of spontaneous. And so this week they kind of reenacted. MPs stood in silence again, and in the public gallery looking on were 3 or 4 British Holocaust survivors. So lots of sort of love for Lindsay Hoyle, the Speaker, for organising this and for saying, look, it's very rare for the House of Commons to fall quiet. It's hard to shut this lot up, he sort of joked. But this time we're doing it. Lots of love and sort of applause for that. I would just offer this slightly dissenting note, which is the reason why that event is so poignant, that 1942 moment of silence, is in a way because it came so early and stands as proof that Britain, British politicians, but also all kinds of governments across the world, including the United States, even the embryonic United Nations, did know about the Holocaust, and they knew early, relatively early. This is always a landmark event. That this happened means you can't say about 1945, we had no idea, because 2.5 years earlier, end of 1942, the House of Commons, on the floor of the House of Commons, the Nazi plan was essentially laid out. Yes, no references to Auschwitz. That was not known yet, or even gas chambers, but the idea of mass slaughter. And you know, those railway tracks to the death camps, to Auschwitz and others, remained unbombed despite the pleas of Jewish leaders around the world that would come a year later, 2 years later, 2.5 years, etc. So, yes, good for the House of Commons for doing it. Mensch for Lindsay Hoyle for remembering that key moment in Commons history. But it's a prick to the conscience, I think, of British MPs and British history that they knew, and yet so little was done immediately afterwards, beyond that very moving gesture.
Agreed. And not only on British history, also on other countries, that stain remains. Okay, chutzpah?
Yes, indeed. Lots of candidates, I would have thought.
It was a crowded field this week, but we picked the FBI that put out data about they shared their statistics on hate crime, and they said that there is a plunge, which sounds like good news, right? I mean, it's down from 959 cases in 2020 to only 396 cases of anti-Semitic incidents in the U.S. in 2021. Sounds like good news. Just a little bit of a problem there. They forgot, or didn't use, rather, the data from New York, 198 incidents, and from LA. So actually not a plunge in anti-Semitic incidents at all. The FBI said that there's a change in the way that they count. So that's why New York and LA weren't in the statistics originally. But no, there is no, sadly, one should add, no decline in the statistics. This reminds me, Jonathan, of, I don't know if you remember this, but Donald Trump, after he won the election in 2016, but lost the popular vote, he tweeted, "Without New York and California, I won the popular vote." To which I think one person remarked, New York and California are parts of the United States. So New York and LA, two cities, very important in the United States. You should probably keep them on record when you're counting how many anti-Semitic incidents happened in 2021.
I'd forgotten that Donald Trump line. That is so perfect. Apart from all the states I lost, I won everywhere.
Exactly.
So it is such, but it's exquisite in this context. If you're counting anti-Semitic hate crimes, you've kind of got to include New York and LA. Otherwise, as I think one leader of a Jewish group did say, the data is essentially useless. In fact, that was a scholar, not of a Jewish group, but of a human rights center. So, you can't you can't cherry pick when you're doing stats like this. So these numbers, I think, will be ignored, and people will look instead at the numbers for next year. And yes, the underlying trend, I'm afraid, does not look too good, even if you try and keep out the places where Jews live to make them look a little bit better. Although, of course, that wasn't the intention. It's just how it washed out.
So look at us lifting the spirits of everyone during Shabbat. Yeah. I mean, we're very good at this, I think.
But we did give people a little bit of cheer, didn't we? Remember, we have a solution. This podcast has brought it to you, to the world's energy crisis. Long term, admittedly, but that's a little bit of cheer. And you can listen again to episode, I think you told me, 81 with Malcolm Gladwell. Listen again to that. You could put it on a loop and just cheer yourself up by listening to his dulcet tones and his hopeful message. In between times, you can follow us on Facebook and Instagram, where we are Unholy Podcast, and you can put your messages of celebration and wishing happy 20th anniversary to my terrific and esteemed co-host, Yoni Levy, who marks 20 years to the day in the anchor's chair of Israel's most watched TV news broadcast.
As my Jewish mother would say, it's time to get a real job, Yonit. I think it might be. I think it just might be. Happy Hanukkah, everyone, and we shall meet next week, Jonathan.
We will.
This podcast is brought to you by Cyber attacks can be prevented. Checkpoint. You deserve the best security.